Welcome to Crime Chronicles Confidential, a platform where we uncover the darkest and most haunting true crime stories. Here, we dive deep into the minds of the most notorious criminals, explore the details of unsolved mysteries, and reveal the investigations that changed history. Crime is more than just an act. It is a puzzle of motives, methods, and consequences. Through gripping storytelling and in-depth analysis, we bring you closer to the shocking realities of the world's most infamous cases. Our goal is to keep you engaged, informed, and always wanting to know more. Tonight, we take you into the terrifying world of the Green River Killer, one of America's most prolific and elusive serial killers. For years, a predator roamed unnoticed, leaving behind a trail of victims and unanswered questions. Investigators chased shadows, struggling to connect the dots in a case that would become one of the longest and most complex manhunts in U.S. history. In this chilling documentary, we will walk through every phase of the investigation, from the first shocking discoveries to the confessions that exposed the mind of a remorseless killer. You will witness the fear that gripped the community, the frustration of law enforcement, and the determination that finally led to justice. Stay with us as we unfold a case that reveals the darkest corners of human nature. This is not just a story. It's a journey into the depths of crime and punishment. If you want to explore more true crime mysteries, subscribe to Crime Chronicles Confidential, where we uncover the truth, one case at a time. It began with bodies, dozens of them, discovered near Washington's Green River. Women, young and vulnerable, vanishing without a trace, only to be found lifeless in remote wooded areas and riverbanks. Fear gripped the city of Seattle as police scrambled to connect the dots. A serial killer was hunting in plain sight, and no one knew who he was. For nearly 2 decades, investigators chased shadows. The man behind the murders was careful, methodical, and disturbingly patient. Women continued to disappear, and every discovery of another body only deepened the mystery. The press called him the Green River Killer, but his real identity remained a ghost in the system. The case frustrated law enforcement. Despite collecting evidence, questioning suspects, and launching one of the largest criminal investigations in U.S. history, the Green River Killer remained free. Hundreds of women feared they could be next. Families of the victims were left with unanswered questions and unbearable grief. Then, in 2001, a breakthrough changed everything. DNA technology, more advanced than ever before, linked multiple murders to one man, Gary Ridgway, a seemingly ordinary truck painter. He had spent years living among his neighbors, hiding in plain sight. When confronted with the evidence, Ridgway finally confessed. He admitted to killing at least 49 women, though investigators believe the actual number is much higher. What drove him to commit such horrific crimes? How did he avoid capture for so long? And what did he reveal in his chilling confessions that stunned even the most hardened detectives? Tonight, we take you deep into the mind of one of the most prolific serial killers in American history. This is the story of the Green River Killer, his crimes, his confessions, and the relentless pursuit of justice that finally brought him down. The night was silent, except for the soft rustling of leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. The moon hung low in the sky, casting a pale glow over the Green River, its surface rippling gently under the cool night breeze. A man, walking along the riverbank, took careful steps over the damp earth, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. He wasn't supposed to be here this late. Just a routine walk, he told himself. But as he moved closer to the water's edge, something caught his eye, a shape, barely visible, tangled in the reeds. His heart pounded as he stepped forward, his breath hitching in his throat. The light from his flashlight trembled in his grip as he focused on the object in the water. A hand, pale, motionless, partially submerged beneath the current. For a moment he froze. His mind struggled to make sense of what he was seeing. Then, panic set in. He stumbled back, nearly slipping on the muddy ground, his breath quickening as he realized this was no accident. Someone had been left here. Shakily, he reached for his phone, his fingers fumbling to dial 911. The call connected. 911, what's your emergency? Came the voice on the other end. The man's voice cracked. I think I found a body. There's a hand sticking out of the water. Silence. Then, the dispatcher's tone sharpened. Where are you? He swallowed hard, looking around, his own shadow stretching long under the moonlight. Green River, near the old bridge. The dispatcher's voice remained calm, but there was an urgency beneath it. Stay where you are. Officers are on their way. He nodded to himself, though no one was there to see it. His heart hammered against his ribs as he took a slow step back from the water, his flashlight still fixated on the lifeless hand. Somewhere in the distance, sirens began to wail, piercing through the stillness of the night. Unbeknownst to him, this was just the beginning, the first of many discoveries that would reveal one of the most horrifying serial murder cases in American history. And the Green River Killer's reign of terror was far from over. The 911 dispatcher had handled countless calls, car accidents, domestic disputes, the occasional lost pet. But there was something different about this one. The voice on the other end was shaky, laced with panic, as if the caller had stumbled into something truly horrifying. 911, what's your emergency? She asked, her fingers already hovering over the keyboard, ready to take down the details. A man's breathless voice came through. I think I found something. A body. There's the hand in the water. The dispatcher sat up straighter. Where are you, sir? Green River, near the old bridge. His voice quivered. I was just walking, and I saw it sticking out of the water. It looks real. I don't know what to do. The dispatcher's eyes flicked to the large clock on the wall. It was nearly midnight. Stay where you are. Do not touch anything. Officers are on their way. The man exhaled shakily. I think there's more. The water's moving, but I see something under the surface. Oh my God! The dispatcher kept her voice steady, though a chill ran down her spine. Sir, do you see any signs of movement? Any other people around? The caller hesitated, then whispered, No, it's just so quiet. She typed rapidly, signaling an urgent response. A possible body recovery. Green River. Within moments, the radio crackled to life in the Seattle Police Department's control room. All units, possible 10 to 54 near the Green River Bridge. Caller reports a body in the water. First responders, proceed with caution. The dispatcher turned back to the man. Sir, officers will be there shortly. Can you stay on the line? A shuffling sound came through. Yeah, I can stay. The wait felt endless. The man kept breathing heavily into the phone, shifting nervously as the water lapped against the riverbank. Then, in the distance, flashing red and blue lights, reflecting against the trees. The sound of sirens growing louder. A voice barked through a police radio. We've arrived. Moving in to assess. A few tense moments passed, then another officer's voice crackled over the line. We have a confirmed body. Female. This is a crime scene. Secure the area. The dispatcher inhaled sharply. Another silence followed, thick, suffocating. Before the officer spoke again, this time lower, graver. This isn't the first one, and I don't think it'll be the last. The flashing red and blue lights cast eerie reflections on the rippling water as officers moved swiftly to secure the scene. The riverbank was damp, the scent of wet earth and decaying foliage thick in the air. Yellow tape was stretched across the area, sealing off what was now an active crime scene. Detective Mike Thompson stepped out of his unmarked car, his sharp eyes scanning the surroundings. The first officer on the scene approached him, his face pale under the flickering lights. Female victim, the officer reported, partially submerged. No visible ID. No purse, no personal belongings. Looks like she was dumped here. Thompson nodded grimly and moved closer to the shoreline. 2 crime scene investigators were already working, their gloved hands carefully examining the body. The victim's arms were positioned unnaturally, her clothes soaked, strands of hair clinging to her pale face. The river had started to claim her, but there was something disturbingly deliberate about the way she was left. Signs of struggle? Thompson asked. One of the forensic techs shook his head. Not here. No drag marks, no blood. She wasn't killed here. She was placed. That meant the killer had taken her somewhere else first. He had planned this, thought it through. A few feet away, another officer waved them over. You're going to want to see this. Thompson followed him up the slope, where muddy footprints led away from the riverbank. They were faint, almost smudged by the dampness. But there were no signs of a chase, no deep impressions suggesting a struggle. The prints were careful, methodical. He knew what he was doing, Thompson muttered. He wasn't in a hurry. Another officer approached. No tire tracks nearby. If he used a vehicle, he parked far away and carried her here. Thompson exhaled slowly. So, we're dealing with someone cautious. Someone who takes his time. The thought was unsettling. A careless killer made mistakes. A careful one could stay hidden for years. By now, forensic specialists were sweeping the area. They combed through every inch of the riverbank, searching for fibers, fingerprints, anything that could lead them to a suspect. Nothing. No weapon. No DNA. No obvious signs of how she had been killed. It was as if the killer had vanished into thin air. Thompson's jaw tightened. He had seen killers who acted on impulse, but this was different. This wasn't just a crime. It was a ritual. And somewhere in the darkness, the Green River Killer was watching, knowing they had found only what he wanted them to find. The discovery of the first body sent a ripple of fear through the community. But at first, no one thought it was part of something bigger. A tragic crime, perhaps a one-time event. But then it happened again, and again. In the weeks that followed, reports of missing women began to increase. Young women, many of them sex workers or runaways, vanishing without a trace. Families filed reports, but too often, their pleas were met with indifference. Some officers believed these women had simply left town or moved on. But those who knew them, mothers, sisters, friends, knew better. Something was wrong. Then more bodies appeared, one by one. Victims surfaced along the Green River and its surrounding wooded areas. Some were found partially submerged in shallow water, others hidden beneath leaves and branches. It was no longer a question of coincidence. Seattle had a predator lurking in its midst. By the time the fourth and fifth bodies were found, police could no longer deny the horrifying reality. This was the work of a serial killer. The media caught wind of the gruesome discoveries, and soon the city was gripped by fear. The killer earned a name, the Green River Killer. But who was he? The victims had similarities, mostly young women, many from troubled backgrounds, often with little support or resources. Women who wouldn't immediately be missed by society. That's what made them easy targets. Detectives scoured the crime scenes for clues, but the killer was meticulous. No fingerprints, no eyewitnesses, no signs of struggle. Whoever was responsible knew how to cover his tracks. He chose his victims carefully. He knew where to take them, how to control them, and how to dispose of them without leaving a trace. As the body count rose, so did the panic. Women feared walking alone at night. Families of missing women lived in constant dread, wondering if their loved ones would be found in the river next. The city demanded answers. The police had none. And the killer? He was still out there, still hunting. And no one knew when or where he would strike next. The Green River Killer wasn't reckless. He was precise, calculated, and eerily patient. His victims weren't chosen at random. He knew exactly who to target and how to make them disappear without a trace. He hunted in places where no one was looking. Downtown Seattle, Pacific Highway South, areas where sex workers and runaways tried to survive on the fringes of society. Women who had no stable home, no close family to check in on them, no one who would immediately raise an alarm if they went missing. Gary Ridgway, the man who would later confess to these crimes, appeared harmless. With his average looks and soft-spoken demeanor, he didn't fit the image of a monster. He wasn't an outcast or a loner. He held a steady job as a truck painter and even had relationships. He was, by all appearances, normal. And that's what made him so dangerous. He knew how to manipulate. He used charm and fake kindness to lure women into his truck, offering them a ride, sometimes showing them a picture of his son to make himself seem trustworthy. Once inside, they never stood a chance. His method was chillingly simple. He preferred strangulation. No gunshots, no loud screams, no blood. Strangulation gave him control. It let him decide exactly when his victim took her last breath. He used his bare hands at times, other times a ligature, whatever was convenient. And then, he discarded the bodies in remote areas, often near the Green River, sometimes dumping multiple victims in the same spot to confuse investigators. Ridgway was careful. He learned from the mistakes of other serial killers. He never kept trophies. He never returned to a crime scene unless it was to dispose of another body. He left no obvious forensic evidence. He even continued his daily routine as if nothing had happened, going to work, maintaining relationships, blending into society. But there was something even more twisted. He enjoyed the game. He watched the news. He followed the investigation. He took pride in outsmarting law enforcement. When he realized the police were watching certain locations, he adapted. He changed his disposal sites, switched his tactics, even made fake calls to mislead detectives. He wanted them to chase shadows. For years, they did. While police scrambled for leads, Ridgway kept hunting. He grew more confident, more refined. He perfected his ability to vanish into the background, to walk among his neighbors unnoticed. By the time law enforcement realized the full extent of his crimes, dozens of women had already disappeared. And the Green River Killer? He was just getting started. News of the murders spread like wildfire, and soon, the entire city of Seattle was gripped with fear. Women were vanishing, their bodies turning up in shallow graves, forests, and riverbanks. The Green River Killer wasn't just a name in the headlines. He was a phantom that haunted the streets. The local media fueled the hysteria. Each new body found was another front-page story. News anchors spoke in hushed, serious tones, warning women to stay indoors, to never walk alone, to trust no one. The police, under immense pressure, assured the public they were doing everything they could. But deep down, even they knew they were chasing a ghost. The fear was suffocating. Women avoided going out at night. Parents begged their daughters to stay home. Sex workers, the primary targets, started working in groups, always watching their backs. But it didn't matter. The killer was always one step ahead. For law enforcement, the case was a nightmare. The bodies weren't just showing up in one place. They were scattered across different locations, making it difficult to connect all the cases at first. The victims had similar backgrounds, but there was no clear pattern in how they were chosen, no forensic evidence left behind. Investigators formed the Green River Task Force, a specialized unit dedicated solely to catching the killer. Officers spent countless hours combing through missing person reports, following up on leads, and interviewing potential witnesses. But there was one problem: the sheer volume of cases. At one point, the police had over 40 potential victims, all missing women who matched the killer's profile. With each passing week, more families came forward, reporting loved ones who had vanished under similar circumstances. The workload was overwhelming, and resources were stretched thin. The community grew restless. People demanded answers. Why couldn't the police catch him? Why was he still free? Some women took matters into their own hands. They carried weapons, learned self-defense, stayed in well-lit areas. But the killer was unpredictable. He adapted. If his usual hunting grounds became too risky, he changed locations. And the most terrifying part? No one had seen him. No one had heard the screams. No one knew what he looked like. It was as if the Green River Killer was invisible. And that, more than anything, sent chills through the city of Seattle. Desperate for a break in the case, investigators began narrowing their focus on potential suspects. With bodies piling up in the city in a state of panic, the pressure on law enforcement was immense. They needed anyone, to hold accountable for the Green River murders. Then a name surfaced. A local man, known for his interactions with sex workers, had been reported acting suspiciously. He had a criminal record, a history of violence, and had been seen in areas where victims were last spotted. He fit the profile of a predator, someone who could be capable of such horrific crimes. The police moved quickly. They brought him in for questioning, hoping they had finally caught the man responsible for the terror gripping Seattle. At first, he denied everything. He claimed he had nothing to do with the murders, that he had never even met the victims. But as detectives pressed harder, inconsistencies started to appear in his statements. He couldn't explain his whereabouts on certain nights. He fumbled when asked about his connections to the missing women. Detectives believed they had their man. The media got wind of the arrest, and the city held its breath. Was this finally the moment Seattle would be free from fear? Had the Green River Killer been caught? The headlines were ready to be printed. But then, just as quickly as hope had appeared, it vanished. DNA testing, still in its early stages at the time, was performed on some of the recovered evidence. The results came back. No match. The man was innocent. Frustration rippled through the task force. They had wasted valuable time on the wrong suspect, while the real killer was still out there, possibly planning his next attack. The public, desperate for answers, grew impatient. Some started to lose faith in the police. How could they not catch him? How many more women had to die before they got it right? The detectives, however, were learning. The Green River Killer wasn't just another criminal. He was careful, methodical, and deceptive. They needed to rethink their approach. But while they regrouped, the killer struck again. A new body was found, and with it, a chilling realization. Seattle's most terrifying predator was still hunting, and he was far from finished. For years, the Green River Killer remained a phantom, a nameless shadow leaving behind a trail of bodies and fear. Investigators had followed countless leads, questioned suspects, and sifted through mountains of evidence. But nothing ever led to him. The case dragged on, growing colder with each passing year. Then, in 2001, everything changed. Forensic science had advanced dramatically since the early days of the investigation. DNA technology, once unreliable and limited, was now powerful enough to solve cases that had seemed unsolvable. Detectives who had worked the case decades earlier had collected physical evidence from crime scenes, tiny traces of the killer that, at the time, they couldn't fully analyze. Now they could. With renewed hope, investigators reopened the files, meticulously re-examining everything in their possession. The breakthrough came when they tested biological samples collected from multiple victims, samples that had been stored for years, waiting for the day science would catch up. And it did. The results came back with an unmistakable match. The DNA belonged to one man, Gary Ridgway. It was a name that had briefly surfaced in the investigation years earlier. Ridgway had been questioned in the 1980s, but had passed a polygraph test and had no concrete evidence linking him to the murders. He had slipped through the cracks, right under the noses of law enforcement. But now, there was no escaping the truth. The DNA found on multiple victims, the strands of evidence left behind decades ago, all pointed to him. The Green River Killer wasn't a nameless monster anymore. He was a man who had been living in plain sight, a man who had a steady job, relationships, a normal life, while carrying the weight of dozens of murders in the darkness of his mind. The moment the results were confirmed, authorities moved swiftly. They followed Ridgway, watching him, making sure he had no idea he was about to be caught. Once they had enough evidence, they made their move. November 30th, 2001, Gary Ridgway was arrested outside the truck factory where he worked. As officers placed the cuffs around his wrists, he remained eerily calm. He didn't struggle. He didn't deny. It was as if he knew, after all these years, that his time had finally run out. But the most chilling part was still to come. Because once in custody, Gary Ridgway didn't just admit to the murders. He confessed to far more than anyone had imagined. From the moment Gary Ridgway was taken into custody, detectives expected resistance. Most serial killers denied their crimes, fought the accusations, and tried to manipulate the system. But Ridgway, he played a different game, one that left even the most experienced investigators shaken. In the early days of questioning, he was calm, too calm. He listened, nodded, and answered in a flat, emotionless tone. He didn't rage or panic. He didn't demand a lawyer or insist on his innocence. Instead, he gave just enough information to keep the detectives engaged, but never enough to fully incriminate himself. At first, he denied everything. "I don't know these women," he said. "I had nothing to do with this." But the evidence was undeniable. DNA had placed him at multiple crime scenes. The detectives pressed harder. That's when his strategy shifted. Rather than outright denial, Ridgway began to mix truth with lies. He admitted to knowing some of the victims, but insisted their encounters were harmless. He suggested that, yes, maybe he had been with them, but he hadn't killed them. Maybe they had gone with someone else afterward. Maybe someone was framing him. It was a classic misdirection. Then, as investigators presented more irrefutable evidence, Ridgway changed tactics again. He started confessing, but only to some of the murders. He drip-fed information, revealing just enough details to make it seem like he was cooperating while still keeping crucial secrets to himself. He played on the uncertainty. He knew that investigators needed him to talk. If he confessed to some killings, but not all, he could create doubt about the full extent of his crimes. Maybe he could convince them that he wasn't as bad as they thought. Maybe he could get a lighter sentence. He also took advantage of the fact that many of his victims were still missing. Some bodies had never been found, and he used that to his advantage. "I don't remember where I left them," he would say, shaking his head. It was so long ago, he knew exactly where they were. But by pretending to forget, he stayed in control. The police needed his information, which meant they couldn't push too hard, couldn't risk losing his cooperation. For months, he toyed with investigators. He confessed, then backtracked. He promised to help locate bodies, but conveniently forgot key details. It was a psychological game, and Ridgway was a master at it. He had fooled them once before, years ago, when he was first a suspect. Back then, he had taken and passed a polygraph test, one of the reasons he had been overlooked. He had lied effortlessly, his heart rate steady, his nerves undisturbed. Now, even with the truth closing in, he still found ways to manipulate the system. But despite his efforts, the evidence against him was overwhelming. His days of deception were over, and when detectives finally broke through his defenses, Ridgway made a confession that would go down as one of the most chilling in criminal history. Not only had he killed the women they knew about, he had killed far more. "How many?" one investigator asked. Ridgway's response was as cold as it was haunting. "I stopped counting at 40. On the morning of November 30th, 2001, detectives surrounded a quiet industrial complex in Renton, Washington. Inside, among the hum of machines and the scent of fresh paint, Gary Ridgway was at work. Just another ordinary day in the life of a man who had lived undetected for decades. But his time was up. As he stepped out of the truck painting facility where he had worked for years, officers closed in. "Gary Ridgway," one of them called out, their voices firm but controlled. "You're under arrest." Ridgway barely reacted. There was no outburst, no resistance. His expression remained disturbingly neutral, as if they had simply asked him to step aside for questioning. He raised his hands without protest, allowing them to cuff him. The detectives expected some emotion, fear, anger, panic. But there was nothing. No sign of regret. No sign of surprise. Just an eerie calm, like a man who had already accepted his fate. As officers read him his rights, the realization sank in. After nearly 2 decades of terror, the Green River Killer was finally caught. Back at headquarters, the news spread fast. Detectives who had worked the case for years, some even retired, were called back in. For so long, this man had been a ghost, a nightmare without a face. And now, he sat in an interrogation room, staring blankly across the table. The evidence against him was ironclad. DNA had tied him to multiple victims. His method of killing matched the profile. The game was over. Still, some officers struggled to believe it. This was a monster they had been chasing, a soft-spoken, unassuming man in his 50s, a man who had managed to blend into society, go to work every day, and carry on relationships, all while leading a double life as one of the most prolific serial killers in American history. The arrest made headlines across the country. Families of the victims held their breath, waiting for answers. Women who had spent years living in fear finally felt a sense of closure. But as the world absorbed the news, another chilling realization followed. If Ridgway had spent all these years hiding in plain sight, how many more victims were still out there? And worse, how many more secrets was he still keeping? Inside the cold, gray walls of the interrogation room, Gary Ridgway sat motionless, his hands cuffed to the metal table. Across from him, seasoned detectives leaned in, waiting for him to speak. For years, they had chased a ghost. Now, the ghost had a voice. Ridgway exhaled, his face void of emotion. Then, in a flat, almost casual tone, he said the words that would haunt them forever. Asterisk, yeah, I did it. Asterisk. The room went silent. One of the detectives shifted in his seat, barely able to contain his disgust. You killed them, he pressed. Ridgway blinked, then nodded. A lot of them. No remorse. No hesitation. He spoke as if he were recounting an ordinary task, like something he had done without a second thought. How many? Another detective asked. Ridgway shrugged. I don't know the exact number, but I stopped counting at 40. The air in the room grew thick with unease. 40. The official count was already staggering, but to hear it from the killer himself, to hear him admit he had lost track, was something else entirely. The detectives pressed further. Why did you do it, Gary? Ridgway thought for a moment, then said something chilling in its simplicity. Asterisk, because I wanted to. Asterisk. There was no elaborate justification, no tragic backstory, no excuse. He had killed because he could, because he enjoyed it. Did you feel anything? One detective asked, his voice almost daring Ridgway to show some shred of humanity. Ridgway tilted his head slightly. I felt good when I did it, he said, his tone disturbingly matter-of-fact. It was easy. He went on to explain how he targeted women who were less likely to be missed, sex workers, runaways, women who lived on the fringes of society. He knew they had no one looking for them, no one to notice when they disappeared. I picked them up, made them feel safe. Some of them even thanked me for the ride, he said with a slight smirk. The detectives clenched their fists, forcing themselves to stay composed. Then what? Ridgway shrugged again. Then I killed them, strangled them, sometimes with my hands, sometimes with a rope, and after that, I dumped them, he said, as if tossing out trash. A lot of them went in the river, some in the woods, some I covered with leaves, some I left out in the open. It didn't really matter. One detective leaned forward, his voice tight with rage. You murdered them, threw them away, and just went back to your life? Went home? Went to work like nothing happened? Ridgway nodded. Yeah, I had to keep going. I had a job, a wife, a life to live. The lack of remorse was suffocating. There was no regret, no second-guessing. Just the cold, hard truth. Ridgway had spent years playing the role of an average man while hiding the mind of a monster. Then came the final question. If we hadn't caught you, would you have kept killing? Ridgway's eyes finally met the detective's. Asterisk, yes. Asterisk. It was a confession that sent chills through the room. A confession that left no doubt. If science hadn't caught up with him, if the police had never cracked the case, the Green River Killer would still be out there. still hunting. And for the families of his victims, that was the most horrifying truth of all. Gary Ridgway's confessions shocked even the most experienced investigators. But while his words painted a picture of a cold, remorseless killer, the biggest question still remained. What kind of mind could commit such monstrous crimes over and over without guilt or hesitation? To answer that, experts turned to forensic psychologists and criminal profilers, those who had spent their careers studying the minds of serial killers. What they found was both disturbing and revealing. A killer hiding in plain sight. Unlike many serial murderers who struggled to blend into society, Ridgway was the perfect chameleon. He held a stable job as a truck painter for over 30 years. He was married multiple times. He lived in an unremarkable suburban home. Nothing about his outward behavior screamed monster, but inside, he was wired differently. According to psychological analysis, Ridgway exhibited clear traits of psychopathy, a total lack of empathy, emotional shallowness, and the ability to manipulate those around him. He was capable of switching between two worlds, one where he was a seemingly normal man, and another where he was a predator hunting for his next victim. He took pleasure in deception. He enjoyed controlling situations, tricking both his victims and later the police. One forensic psychologist put it simply, he had no emotional connection to his victims. To him, they were objects, a deep-rooted obsession with control. Ridgway himself admitted that strangulation was his preferred method of murder, not just because it left no forensic evidence, but because it allowed him complete dominance. He decided how long they suffered. He decided when they took their last breath. That control was what fueled him. Profiler John Douglas, one of the FBI's most renowned experts on serial killers, studied Ridgway's pattern and concluded that he was a mission-oriented killer. He wasn't just killing for pleasure. In his mind, he believed he was cleansing society of women he viewed as disposable. It was the same mindset that had driven other infamous serial killers before him, an internal justification for unspeakable crimes. Childhood roots, the making of a killer. Many serial killers have early warning signs, violent childhoods, abusive families, early signs of sadism. Ridgway's childhood wasn't particularly extreme, but it had clear elements of dysfunction. His mother was controlling and overbearing, often humiliating him in front of others. He later described having confused feelings toward her, love mixed with deep-seated anger. As a child, he struggled in school, had an extremely low IQ, and was known for odd antisocial behavior. Some reports suggest he engaged in animal cruelty, a key early sign of psychopathy. One of the most telling moments in his youth? At the age of 16, Ridgway stabbed a 6-year-old boy. He led the boy into the woods and, without any real motive, plunged a knife into his body. The boy survived, but Ridgway showed no remorse. It was an early glimpse into the darkness he would later embrace fully. Why didn't he stop? Unlike impulsive killers who strike once in a fit of rage, Ridgway was methodical. He planned. He learned. He evolved. In the beginning, he made mistakes. He returned to some crime scenes. He left bodies too close together. He stuck to familiar dumping grounds. But when he sensed the police were closing in, he adapted. He started spacing out his killings, disposing of victims in different locations. He kept trophies at first, then later realized it was too risky. This ability to learn and refine his methods made him even deadlier. When psychologists asked why he kept killing, Ridgway gave one of the coldest answers imaginable. It became my career. Could he have been stopped sooner? Looking back, experts believe there were many red flags. His early violent act, his obsession with prostitutes, his previous brushes with the law. But at the time, law enforcement lacked the forensic tools to connect him to his crimes. It was only DNA advancements decades later that finally ended his killing spree. One profiler summed it up best. Ridgway wasn't a genius. He wasn't some criminal mastermind. He was just disciplined, emotionless, and terrifyingly patient. That's why he got away with it for so long. The mind of a monster. Even behind bars, Ridgway never expressed true remorse. He admitted his crimes, but only in a detached, mechanical way, like he was describing something that had happened to someone else. Psychologists agreed on one thing: he was incapable of empathy. For him, human life held no value, and that, more than anything, was what made him one of the most terrifying serial killers in history. The trial of Gary Ridgway was one of the most anticipated in American history. For decades, the Green River Killer had terrorized the streets of Seattle, leaving behind a trail of bodies and broken families. Now, he was finally in court, forced to face justice. The question on everyone's mind was clear: would he receive the death penalty? As Ridgway entered the packed courtroom, he remained as expressionless as ever. There was no fear in his eyes, no visible remorse. He sat motionless, his hands folded, while the families of his victims watched him with a mixture of rage and grief. The prosecution was relentless. "This man is a predator," the lead prosecutor declared in his opening statement. "He murdered in cold blood, again and again, without mercy. The only appropriate punishment for his crimes is death." The courtroom was silent, except for the quiet sobs of grieving family members. The prosecution presented the overwhelming evidence against Ridgway: DNA matches, crime scene connections, and his own chilling confessions. They showed how he had deceived investigators for years, how he had toyed with victims, how he had discarded their bodies like garbage. He didn't stop because he felt guilty, the prosecutor continued. He stopped because we caught him. It seemed like an open and shut case. The death penalty was the expected outcome. The families of the victims, still reeling from years of unanswered questions, wanted nothing less than the ultimate punishment. Then, the defense made its move. Ridgway's attorneys proposed a controversial deal: a guilty plea in exchange for life in prison instead of execution. Their argument: if Ridgway was sentenced to death, he would stop talking, but if spared, he would help locate the remains of still missing victims. This plea deal sparked outrage. Families wanted justice. They wanted Ridgway to pay with his life for the pain he had caused. One victim's mother stood in court, her voice shaking with fury. "He took my daughter's life. Why should he get to keep his?" But the reality was brutal. Many victims were still unaccounted for. Their bodies had never been found. If Ridgway was executed, those families might never get the answers they desperately needed. In the end, after intense deliberation, prosecutors agreed to the plea deal. Gary Ridgway would avoid the death penalty, but he would spend the rest of his life behind bars, with no chance of parole. When the judge announced the sentence, there was no reaction from Ridgway, no relief, no regret. He simply stood there, as if the outcome had never mattered to him in the first place. For the families, the verdict was bittersweet. He wouldn't die for his crimes, but at least he would never walk free again. Justice, in its own way, had been served, but for the loved ones of the victims, no punishment would ever be enough, because no sentence, no amount of suffering, could ever bring their daughters, sisters, and mothers back. The courtroom was filled with a heavy silence as the families of Gary Ridgway's victims took their turn speaking. For years, they had been waiting for this moment, waiting to stand before the man who had stolen their daughters, sisters, and mothers. One by one, they stepped forward, their voices trembling with grief, anger, and unimaginable pain. A mother, her hands shaking as she clutched a photo of her lost daughter, stared directly at Ridgway. "You took my baby from me," she said, her voice breaking. "She was only 18. She trusted you. She had dreams. And you threw her away like trash." Her tears streamed down her face, but Ridgway remained still, his expression blank. Another woman, the sister of a victim, took a deep breath before speaking. "For years, we waited for her to come home. We prayed she was still alive somewhere. But you knew the whole time. You knew she was lying in the dirt where you left her." Her fists clenched as she fought back sobs. "You ruined lives. You destroyed families. And yet, you sit there with no remorse, no soul, nothing." A father, his face hardened with years of grief, stepped forward. You will never understand what you took from us. You didn't just kill our daughters. You killed a part of us too." He exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "You deserve worse than life in prison. You deserve to feel what they felt." Then, something unexpected happened. An elderly man, the father of one of the victims, approached the podium. His eyes were filled with sorrow, but instead of rage, there was something else. Something no one expected. "I forgive you." A murmur spread through the courtroom. Even the judge looked up, momentarily stunned. The old man continued, his voice soft yet steady. "I'm not forgiving you because you deserve it. I'm forgiving you because I refuse to let my heart be poisoned by hate." For the first time, Ridgway showed something. A flicker of emotion. His eyes welled up. His lips trembled. Was it guilt? Regret? Or just the realization that someone he had hurt so deeply could still show him mercy? No one knew. What they did know was that no amount of prison time, no sentence, no punishment could undo the pain he had caused. As the last family member stepped away from the podium, the judge prepared to issue the final ruling. But in that moment, the most powerful statement had already been made. Not by the court, but by the voices of the broken, the grieving, the survivors. They had spoken their truth, and even in the face of a monster, they had found the strength to stand tall. The moment had finally arrived. The courtroom, packed with victims' families, reporters, and law enforcement officers who had spent decades chasing the Green River Killer, fell into a heavy silence as the judge prepared to deliver the final verdict. Gary Ridgway sat motionless, his hands resting on the table, his face as unreadable as ever. He had spent years evading justice, manipulating investigators, and taking lives without remorse. Now, the law would decide his fate. The judge's voice broke the silence. "Gary Leon Ridgway, you have pleaded guilty to the murders of 49 women. The evidence against you is overwhelming. Your crimes are among the most horrific this court has ever seen. You preyed on the vulnerable. You showed no mercy, and you took pleasure in the suffering of others. You are, by every definition, a predator." A pause. The air felt thick with anticipation. This court sentences you to life in prison, without the possibility of parole. A wave of mixed emotions swept through the courtroom. Some gasped, others nodded solemnly. For the families of the victims, it was a painful victory. Ridgway would never see freedom again, never harm another soul. But for many, it still didn't feel like enough. Some had hope for the death penalty, believing it was the only punishment fitting for a man who had stolen so many lives. But the plea deal had sealed his fate. Life behind bars in a cage where he would be forgotten by the world. Ridgway, however, showed no visible reaction. He did not protest. He did not beg for mercy. He simply sat there, blank and emotionless, as if the sentencing had no real meaning to him. The judge leaned forward slightly, his voice now lower, almost personal. "Mr. Ridgway, you have left behind unimaginable pain. You will never again walk free, never again control another person's life. You will spend the rest of your days in a cell, surrounded by nothing but the weight of what you have done." Ridgway blinked but said nothing. No apology, no regret, just silence. As the hearing came to an end, the families of the victims slowly rose from their seats. Some whispered prayers. Others exchanged quiet looks, knowing that while this was the closest thing to justice they would ever receive, it could never undo the past. Ridgway was led out of the courtroom in shackles, disappearing through the heavy doors. The Green River Killer's reign of terror was over. But for the families of his victims, the pain of what he had done would never truly fade. As Gary Ridgway disappeared into the prison system, locked away for the rest of his life, one haunting question remained. Are there more killers like him still out there? The uncomfortable truth is, yes. Serial killers like the Green River Killer don't just exist in history books or crime documentaries. They still walk among us, hiding in plain sight, just as Ridgway did for decades. The FBI estimates that at any given time, Dozens of active serial killers are operating in the United States alone. Some are calculated and methodical, choosing victims who are less likely to be missed, just as Ridgway did. Others are impulsive, leaving behind trails of chaos that make them easier to catch. Modern advancements in forensic science, surveillance, and law enforcement techniques have made it far more difficult for serial killers to operate as freely as they did in the past. DNA databases, security cameras, and digital footprints all play a role in solving crimes faster than ever before. But despite these advancements, serial murder hasn't disappeared, it has evolved. Many killers today adapt their methods to avoid detection. Some use online platforms to lure victims. Others target transient populations, knowing that their disappearances won't attract immediate attention. Some even study forensic science, learning how to cover their tracks better than ever before. The world isn't as safe as we would like to believe. Cases of unidentified bodies, missing persons, and unsolved murders still fill police archives. Some of them, when finally solved, will reveal the existence of a predator who has been operating undetected for years. So, are we truly safe? The best defense is awareness, knowing the dangers, staying vigilant, and recognizing the patterns that criminals exploit. Law enforcement has learned from past mistakes. Cases like the Green River Killer have shaped modern investigative strategies, ensuring that new threats don't go unnoticed for as long. But one terrifying reality remains. Somewhere right now, there may be another serial killer, blending into society, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And until they are caught, their victims remain just another missing person. Serial killers like Gary Ridgway don't emerge from nowhere. They exploit weaknesses in the system, gaps in law enforcement, societal neglect of vulnerable populations, and a lack of public awareness. The question is, can we stop them before they strike? While it's impossible to eliminate crime completely, there are steps that both law enforcement and ordinary citizens can take to make it much harder for predators to operate undetected. Law enforcement. Strengthening the system. 1. Better data sharing across agencies. Many serial killers go undetected for years because their crimes span multiple jurisdictions. Police departments must improve communication and data sharing to connect patterns earlier, preventing killers from exploiting gaps between different agencies. 2. Investing in advanced forensic technology. DNA databases, criminal profiling, and AI-driven predictive analytics have revolutionized crime solving, continuing to expand forensic capabilities, from rapid DNA testing to facial recognition, can help catch criminals before they claim more victims. 3. Prioritizing missing persons cases. Many victims, especially runaways, sex workers, and marginalized individuals, are ignored or not reported missing immediately. Law enforcement must treat all disappearances seriously, ensuring that missing persons cases don't slip through the cracks. 4. Psychological profiling and behavioral analysis. FBI profilers have played a crucial role in identifying serial offenders by recognizing patterns in their behavior. Expanding behavioral analysis training in local police forces can improve their ability to detect emerging threats before they escalate. 5. Community policing and public trust. When people don't trust the police, crimes go unreported. Strengthening community police relations encourages civilians to come forward with vital information that could prevent future crimes. How ordinary people can stay safe. 1. Be aware of your surroundings. Many serial killers, including Ridgway, targeted people in isolated areas where they were vulnerable. Avoid walking alone at night, and always be cautious in unfamiliar environments. 2. Trust your instincts. If something feels off, whether it's a stranger acting strangely, an unsettling online interaction, or a suspicious situation, don't ignore your gut feeling. Predators often rely on their victims hesitating or doubting themselves. 3. Use technology for safety. Share your location with a trusted friend when traveling alone. Use safety apps that alert emergency contacts in distress situations. Be cautious about meeting strangers from online platforms. 4. Help protect the vulnerable. Serial killers often prey on those who are overlooked by society: runaways, homeless individuals, and sex workers. Supporting community initiatives that offer resources to at-risk individuals can make it harder for predators to find easy targets. 5. Report suspicious behavior. Many serial killers could have been stopped earlier if someone had spoken up. If you see something that seems off, an unusual pattern of disappearances, a neighbor behaving strangely, or someone lurking in unsafe areas, report it. Your tip could save lives. The fight against serial crime never ends. While law enforcement continues to develop new techniques to track criminals, serial killers still exist. They may be more cautious, more calculated, and harder to catch, but they are not unstoppable. With vigilance, technology, and a collective effort from both authorities and everyday citizens, we can make it harder for predators to hide, harder for them to kill, and easier to bring them to justice. Because the only way to truly stop a serial killer is to catch them before they become one. Even after Gary Ridgway's conviction and life sentence, the story of the Green River Killer is far from over. The case may be closed, but many questions remain unanswered. Questions that haunt investigators, the families of victims, and anyone who followed the case. The most chilling mystery? Some of Ridgway's victims are still missing. Unfound victims. The missing pieces. Ridgway officially pleaded guilty to 49 murders, but in his own words, he admitted, "I stopped counting at 40. Authorities believe the true number could be much higher, possibly over 80 victims. But despite extensive searches, some bodies have never been found." Ridgway himself was vague when asked about their locations. "I don't remember where I put them," he claimed. "It was so long ago." Was he telling the truth? Or was this another manipulation, another way to maintain control even from behind bars? Did Ridgway hide more evidence? Investigators suspect that Ridgway may have intentionally misled them about certain burial sites. In multiple cases, the locations he provided were vague or completely inaccurate. Could it be that there are still bodies hidden in Washington's forests, buried beneath years of leaves and dirt? Could remains be lying undiscovered at the bottom of the Green River, washed away by time? Search teams have continued to explore potential sites, but as years pass, the likelihood of recovering every victim diminishes. Could there be more secrets? Some detectives who worked the case believe that Ridgway held back key details, possibly even the names of victims he never confessed to. One former investigator stated, "We may never know the full extent of his crimes. He took many secrets to prison with him." Others wonder if Ridgway had accomplices at any stage, someone who knew about his crimes but never came forward. So far, no evidence suggests this, but the possibility lingers. Will he ever reveal the truth? Ridgway, now serving multiple life sentences, has little to lose. Yet, he remains largely silent about the missing victims. Some believe that if he were to admit to more murders, it would be his final way of exerting power, forcing families to relive the pain, making law enforcement chase more dead ends. Others think that, in his old age, he may one day decide to confess everything, if only for attention. The haunting reality. For the families of missing women suspected to be Ridgway's victims, closure remains out of reach. Without bodies, without definitive answers, they are left in limbo, clutching faded photos, hoping for discoveries that may never come. The Green River Killer may be behind bars, but his shadow still lingers. His crimes have left permanent scars on the city of Seattle, on the families he destroyed, and on the investigators who spent decades chasing him. And until every victim is found, until every question is answered, the case of the Green River Killer will never truly be over. If this story gripped you, if the chilling details of the Green River Killer kept you on the edge of your seat, then there's so much more for you to uncover. True crime is filled with mysteries, some solved, some still haunting us to this day. And here at Crime Chronicles Confidential, we dive deep into the minds of criminals, the intricacies of investigations, and the relentless pursuit of justice. So, if you don't want to miss the next shocking case, make sure to subscribe to our channel, Stay updated as we unravel the world's most disturbing crimes. Hit the like button. It helps us bring you more in-depth true crime stories. Leave a comment. What are your thoughts on this case? Do you think there are still secrets left to uncover? Share this video, spread awareness, because understanding these cases is the first step to preventing future tragedies. Your support keeps us going, and your voice matters. What case should we investigate next? Let us know in the comments below, and we might just feature your suggestion in our next deep dive. Until then, stay aware, stay safe, and remember, sometimes the scariest stories aren't fiction, they're real. We've taken you deep into the terrifying world of the Green River Killer, but the world of true crime is filled with even more chilling mysteries waiting to be uncovered. Now, it's your turn to decide. Which case should we cover next? Should we investigate another notorious serial killer? A mind-bending unsolved mystery? A crime so shocking that it still haunts people to this day? Drop your suggestions in the comments below, and let us know which case fascinates or terrifies you the most. We read every comment, and your idea could be the next gripping story featured on Crime Chronicles Confidential. And don't forget, if you found this case interesting, make sure to like this video to support our work. Subscribe so you never miss an episode. Share this story with fellow true crime enthusiasts. Your engagement helps us bring you the most detailed, well-researched true crime stories. So, what's next? Tell us your pick if you dare.